Wei Chen was 47 years old and had been living in Seattle for 9 years when he decided to open an Asian grocery store in the Beacon Hill neighborhood. A business idea he'd been developing carefully for over 2 years through meticulous research and planning and financial preparation. But when he applied for a small business loan to cover startup costs for inventory and equipment and store fixtures, every single bank he approached told him no, and the rejections came with polite, professional explanations that never quite said directly what Wei suspected was the real reason, which was that he was a Chinese immigrant with accented English and limited credit history in America, and banks simply didn't trust people like him with their money regardless of how solid his business plan was or how much he'd saved for a down payment. Wei had emigrated from Guangzhou, China with his wife Mei and their daughter Lin when Lin was 7 years old, leaving behind Wei's career as an accountant at a manufacturing company and Mei's work as a schoolteacher to pursue what they believed would be greater opportunities and stability in America. They'd arrived with 2 suitcases, approximately $8,000 in savings that represented years of careful accumulation, basic conversational English that Wei and Mei had studied intensively before emigrating, an enormous hope mixed with realistic understanding that rebuilding their lives in a new country would be difficult and would require years of hard work and sacrifice and patience. The first 5 years had been brutally hard in ways Wei hadn't fully anticipated despite his attempts at realistic preparation. His Chinese accounting credentials and experience meant nothing to American employers who required specific certifications and degrees from recognized institutions and native-level English fluency, and he'd worked as a warehouse stocker at a large retail chain for 2 years while studying English at night and saving every possible dollar. Then had moved to a slightly better-paying position as a bookkeeper at a small import-export company owned by another Chinese immigrant who understood the challenges of credential translation and language barriers and was willing to hire someone with Wei's actual skills rather than just his American-recognized qualifications. Mei had found work as a teaching assistant at an elementary school in South Seattle, where her limited English was less of a barrier, because she worked primarily with younger children and many of the students came from immigrant families themselves, and the school valued her patience and warmth with kids who were navigating multiple languages and cultures. Lin had adapted to American schools with the resilience of childhood, had learned English faster than her parents through immersion and peer interaction, had gradually become the family's translator and cultural bridge, helping Wei and Mei navigate systems and institutions and social contexts that remain partially mysterious and intimidating even after years of living in Seattle. They'd rented a small 2-bedroom apartment in Beacon Hill, a neighborhood that had historically been one of Seattle's most diverse communities with large Asian American and immigrant populations, and Wei had watched over the years as the neighborhood changed in complicated ways that included both positive community development and concerning gentrification that was pushing out longtime residents and small businesses. He'd noticed that while there were several Asian restaurants and small shops, there wasn't a comprehensive Asian grocery store in the immediate neighborhood, which meant that Wei and Mei and their Chinese and Vietnamese and Filipino and Korean neighbors had to travel several miles to the International District or to suburbs like Bellevue to buy the specific ingredients and products they needed for cooking their family's traditional foods. Ingredients like fresh bok choy and Chinese broccoli, and specific brands of rice and sauces and noodles and frozen dumplings that regular American grocery stores either didn't carry at all or carried in limited, overpriced selections in small ethnic food aisles. Wei had started researching the possibility of opening a neighborhood Asian grocery store, had spent months studying successful Asian grocery models in other Seattle neighborhoods and in other cities, had analyzed demographics and foot traffic and competition and pricing strategies, had calculated startup costs and projected revenues, and created detailed spreadsheets showing exactly how much inventory he'd need and what his monthly operating expenses would be and how long it would take to become profitable. He'd saved diligently from his bookkeeper salary and Mei's teaching assistant wages, setting aside several $100s monthly for years. And by the time he felt ready to seriously pursue the business, he had $42,000 in savings accumulated over nearly a decade of careful financial discipline and deferred consumption. His business plan showed he needed approximately $90,000 total to open the store, $42,000 for first and last month's rent on a commercial space plus security deposit, $35,000 for initial inventory purchase, including refrigeration equipment, and shelving and checkout systems, and $13,000 for business licenses and insurance and marketing and operating capital for the first few months before revenue would cover expenses. With his $42,000 in savings, he needed a small business loan of $48,000, which seemed entirely reasonable given that he had nearly half the required capital already and had created a detailed business plan showing realistic path to profitability within 18 months. Wei had approached 11 different banks over a period of 4 months, had presented his business plan in carefully practiced English, had shown his savings account statements and his 9 years of steady employment history in Seattle and his spreadsheets projecting revenue and expenses, and had been rejected by all 11 institutions with rejections that followed remarkably similar patterns. The loan officers would review his application with polite professional interest, would ask questions about his business experience and his financial projections, would note his limited credit history in the United States and his lack of previous small business ownership, and would ultimately explain that they couldn't approve the loan because he didn't meet their risk criteria, or because his business model seemed too uncertain, or because the amount he was requesting wasn't quite enough to ensure success or was slightly too much given his existing assets. And the reasons shifted slightly from bank to bank, but the result was always the same refusal. Wei had noticed that several of the loan officers had seemed uncomfortable during their conversations, had sensed that they were delivering rejections they didn't entirely believe in themselves. And one loan officer at a community bank had even said somewhat awkwardly that Wei's business plan was actually quite solid and his financial preparation was impressive, but that the bank's underwriting standards required certain criteria that Wei unfortunately didn't meet. And when Wei had asked directly what specific criteria he was missing, the loan officer had become vague and had mentioned things like established business credit and longer documented income history and stronger ties to commercial real estate. Criteria that Wei understood were code language for the fact that he was an immigrant without deep American financial roots, and banks were risk-averse when it came to lending to people they perceived as outsiders. After the 11th rejection, Wei had sat in his car in the bank parking lot for 20 minutes feeling a combination of frustration and humiliation and exhausted resignation, understanding that he could spend another year applying to more banks and would likely receive the same polite professional rejections because the fundamental issue wasn't his business plan or his financial preparation, but rather was the systemic reality that immigrant entrepreneurs faced barriers to capital that had nothing to do with their actual capability or likelihood of success. He'd driven home and had told May that the banks wouldn't help them and that maybe they should give up on the grocery store idea and continue saving, and perhaps in another decade they'd have enough money to start the business without needing any loan at all. And May had listened and had said quietly that giving up seemed wrong when Wei had worked so hard on his planning and when the neighborhood genuinely needed what he wanted to create. Their daughter Lynn was 16 years old by this point and had overheard the conversation, and she'd asked her parents if she could tell some people at the community center about the situation, explaining that there were organizations and networks that helped immigrant entrepreneurs when traditional banks wouldn't. Wei had been skeptical about seeking help from community organizations because he'd always believed in self-reliance and hadn't wanted to appear as though he was asking for charity or handouts. But Lynn had explained that community funding wasn't charity, but rather was people investing in their own neighborhood's development and supporting businesses they wanted to see succeed. And after several days of consideration, Wei had agreed to let Lynn reach out to contacts she'd made through volunteering. At the Beacon Hill Community Center, Lynn had connected with several community organizers who worked specifically on immigrant economic development and small business support, and they'd asked to meet with Wei to review his business plan and discuss alternative funding strategies. 3 weeks after his final bank rejection, Wei had found himself sitting in a small conference room at the community center with 4 people who introduced themselves as members of various local organizations, including an immigrant entrepreneurs cooperative, a community development financial institution, and a neighborhood business alliance. And they'd spent 2 hours asking Wei detailed questions about his business plan and his financial projections and his understanding of the Asian grocery market and his vision for how the store would serve the neighborhood. At the end of that meeting, one of the organizers, a Korean-American woman named Grace Kim, who ran a small business consulting nonprofit, had told Wei directly that his business plan was excellent and his financial preparation was exceptional, and the only reason banks had rejected him was because of systemic discrimination in lending that affected immigrant entrepreneurs regardless of merit, and that her organizations wanted to help him access capital through community-based funding mechanisms that didn't rely on traditional bank approval. She'd explained that they could organize a community crowdfunding campaign through the local Chinese Community Association and through several Pan-Asian community organizations and through the broader Beacon Hill neighborhood network, seeking small investments from community members who would benefit from having a neighborhood Asian grocery store and who wanted to support immigrant entrepreneurship. Wei had felt uncomfortable with the idea of asking community members for money, had worried that it seemed like begging or that people would think he was trying to take advantage of community solidarity. But Grace had explained patiently that community investment was completely different from charity, that people who contributed would be investing in a business they wanted to exist and would receive small equity stakes or store credit in return for their investment, creating a mutual benefit relationship rather than one-sided assistance. She'd said that in her experience, immigrant communities were often eager to invest in neighborhood businesses because they understood better than banks did which businesses would actually succeed and serve community needs. And that Wei's grocery store was exactly the kind of business that community members would enthusiastically support. Over the following month, Grace and other organizers had helped Wei prepare materials for a community crowdfunding campaign, including a simplified version of his business plan written in both English and Chinese, detailed financial projections, photographs and descriptions of the proposed store location, and a clear explanation of what community investors would receive in return for their contributions. They decided to structure the campaign as a combination of small equity investments where contributors would own tiny percentage shares of the business and store credit arrangements where contributors would receive vouchers usable for groceries once the store opened, giving people flexibility in how they wanted to participate based on their financial situations and preferences. The campaign had been announced at a meeting of the Beacon Hill Chinese Community Association, where approximately 60 people had gathered, and Wei had stood in front of the group feeling nervous and inadequate as he explained in Mandarin and broken English his vision for an Asian grocery store that would serve the neighborhood's diverse communities, that would stock fresh produce and ingredients that people currently had to travel miles to purchase, that would create jobs for community members and provide a gathering space where people could shop and meet neighbors and maintain cultural connections through food. He'd explained that he needed $48,000 to supplement his own $42,000 in savings, and that he was seeking community investments starting from as little as $100 up to whatever amounts people could comfortably contribute, with investment returns in the form of either small equity shares or store credit. The response had been immediate and overwhelming in ways Wei hadn't anticipated. People had started pledging contributions during the meeting itself, with amounts ranging from $100 to $2,000, and several older Chinese immigrants had stood up to speak about how much they missed being able to shop at neighborhood stores like the ones they'd had in China, and how important it was to support younger immigrants like Wei who were building businesses that benefited the entire community. By the end of that first meeting, Wei had received pledges totaling $14,000 from 37 different community members, and he'd stood there feeling tears forming in his eyes as person after person had approached him to shake his hand or pat his shoulder and tell him that they believed in his business and wanted to help him succeed. Over the next 6 weeks, the campaign had expanded beyond just the Chinese Community Association to include outreach through Vietnamese community networks and Filipino community groups and Korean churches and Pan-Asian cultural organizations and the General Beacon Hill Neighborhood Association. And Grace and her team had organized several more community meetings where Wei had presented his business plan to different groups. The story had also been covered by local Asian American community newspapers and by Seattle's International Examiner. And the publicity had brought additional investors, including second-generation Asian Americans who wanted to support immigrant entrepreneurship and non-Asian Beacon Hill residents who wanted more diverse shopping options in the neighborhood, and even some people from other Seattle neighborhoods who'd heard about the campaign and wanted to contribute to community-based economic development. 2 months after the initial community association meeting, Wei had raised $53,000 from 247 different investors, exceeding his $48,000 target and giving him a small additional cushion for unexpected startup costs. The amounts individual investors had contributed ranged from $100 to $5,000, with most contributions falling between $200 and $500, and Wei had spent several evenings carefully recording every investor's name and contact information and contribution amount, and whether they'd chosen equity shares or store credit. Understanding that he had enormous responsibility to all these people who'd trusted him with their money when banks had refused. He'd signed a lease on a commercial space on Beacon Hill's main business corridor, a former convenience store that needed some renovation but had good visibility and parking and approximately 2,000 square feet of retail space, plus a small storage area and office. The space had been empty for 8 months because the previous tenant had gone out of business, and the landlord, a Chinese-American man who'd owned the property for 20 years, had been struggling to find new tenants willing to commit to the neighborhood. And when the landlord had learned about Wei's community-funded Asian grocery plan, he'd offered Wei favorable lease terms, including 3 months of reduced rent to help with the startup period, saying that he'd rather have a business that would serve the community and might actually succeed than continue losing money on an empty storefront. Wei had spent the next 4 months preparing the store with help from multiple community volunteers who'd offered their time and skills. An electrician who'd invested $500 had helped install better lighting. A carpenter who'd invested $300 had built custom shelving. High school students, including Lynn and her friends, had painted walls and assembled furniture and cleaned and organized. May had taken leave from her teaching assistant position to help Wei full-time with store preparation, managing inventory orders, and creating price labels in both English and Chinese, and setting up the checkout system, and developing relationships with Asian food suppliers and distributors who could provide the specific products Wei wanted to stock. The store had opened on a Saturday morning with a traditional Chinese ribbon-cutting ceremony attended by over 300 people, including most of the 247 investors and numerous other community members, and local politicians and representatives from community organizations and reporters from Asian American media outlets. Wei had stood in front of his store, officially named Beacon Hill Asian Market, feeling overwhelmed by the crowd and by the reality that his dream had actually materialized through collective community support after every bank had told him it was impossible. And he'd given a short speech in Mandarin and English thanking everyone who'd believed in him and invested in the business, and helped with preparation and promising that he would work every day to make the store worthy of their trust and support. The store had been immediately and consistently busy from opening day forward, with daily customer traffic exceeding Wei's projected estimates, and with community investors bringing friends and family members to shop and spreading word about the store through social networks and community organizations. Wei had stocked the store carefully based on his research and community input, carrying fresh Asian vegetables and fruits that rotated based on seasonal availability, extensive selections of rice and noodles and sauces from multiple Asian cuisines, including Chinese and Vietnamese and Filipino and Korean and Thai and Japanese products, fresh and frozen dim sum and dumplings, Asian snacks and candies and beverages, basic household goods, and a small section of prepared foods including fresh-baked goods from a local Asian bakery, and some simple ready-to-eat items that May prepared in a small commercial kitchen Wei had built in the storage area. 3 months after opening, the store was generating enough revenue to cover all operating expenses, including Wei's and May's salaries and loan repayments to community investors who'd chosen equity arrangements with buyback options. And Wei had started making small quarterly payments to equity investors based on profits, amounts that were modest but that demonstrated the business was financially sustainable and growing. 6 months after opening, Wei had hired 2 part-time employees to help with stocking and checkout, both recent Chinese immigrants who needed English practice-friendly work environments and who appreciated having an employer who understood the challenges of adapting to America while maintaining cultural connections. 1 year after opening, Wei had organized a community investor appreciation event at the store where he'd provided free food and drinks and had given a financial report showing that the business had exceeded first-year projections by 18%, and that all investors who'd chosen store credit options had received their full credit amounts plus a 20% bonus. And investors who'd chosen equity arrangements had received quarterly profit distributions totaling approximately 8% return on their investments. And Wei had announced that he was beginning the process of opening a second location in the Columbia City neighborhood based on similar community-identified need and similar community investment model. The success of Beacon Hill Asian Market had attracted attention from local media, and from economic development organizations studying alternative financing models for immigrant entrepreneurs. And Wei had been interviewed multiple times about his experience with bank rejections and community crowdfunding. And he'd always emphasized that his business hadn't succeeded because he was exceptional, but rather had succeeded because the immigrant community had resources and knowledge and willingness to invest in neighborhood businesses when given the opportunity, and that the real problem was that traditional banking institutions systematically excluded immigrant entrepreneurs regardless of merit or preparation or business viability. Wei had also become involved in mentoring other immigrant entrepreneurs who were facing similar bank rejections and capital access barriers, working with Grace Kim's nonprofit to review business plans and provide advice and connect aspiring business owners with community funding networks and investor groups. 2 years after opening his store, Wei had helped facilitate community crowdfunding campaigns for 7 other immigrant-owned businesses, including a Vietnamese restaurant, a Filipino bakery, a Korean beauty supply store, an Ethiopian coffee shop, a Mexican grocery, a Cambodian alterations shop, and a Chinese-owned hardware store. All businesses that had been rejected by traditional banks, but had successfully raised community capital and had opened and were serving their neighborhoods. Lynn had graduated high school and had gone to the University of Washington studying business and community development, inspired by watching her father's journey from bank rejections to community-supported success, and wanting to build career skills she could use to help other immigrant entrepreneurs access capital and navigate American business systems. She'd worked part-time at Beacon Hill Asian Market throughout college, had helped Wei expand the store's social media presence and online ordering systems, had translated documents, and helped communicate with younger customers and with city officials and regulatory agencies, and had told her father many times that watching the community come together to support his business when institutions had failed him had shaped her understanding of what economic justice and community solidarity could look like in practice. 3 years after opening Beacon Hill Asian Market, Wei had fully repaid all community investors who'd chosen buyback equity arrangements and had converted the remaining equity investors to a permanent cooperative ownership structure where they maintained small ownership stakes and received annual profit distributions and had voting rights on major business decisions, creating a model where the store was genuinely community-owned and accountable to the neighborhood it served rather than to distant shareholders or corporate interests. The second location in Columbia City had opened successfully using similar community investment approaches and was serving another diverse immigrant neighborhood that had been underserved by existing grocery options. Wei had remained in regular contact with several of the bank loan officers who'd rejected his applications years earlier, and one of them had actually visited the store and had congratulated Wei on his success and had admitted somewhat awkwardly that the bank had made a mistake in not approving his loan, and that Wei's business model had proven more viable than many of the businesses the bank had actually funded. Wei had accepted the compliment graciously, but had also said directly that the issue wasn't just one bank's mistake, but rather was a systematic pattern where institutions trusted certain kinds of people and certain kinds of backgrounds while discriminating against immigrants and people of color regardless of actual merit or preparation, and that until banks changed their fundamental approach to risk assessment and relationship building, they would continue missing opportunities to fund viable businesses while contributing to economic inequality and neighborhood disinvestment. Wei Chen's story reminds us that he applied to 11 different banks for a $48,000 small business loan to open an Asian grocery store in Seattle's Beacon Hill neighborhood, presented detailed business plans and financial projections, and $42,000 in personal savings, and was rejected by all 11 institutions with polite explanations that never quite said directly that banks don't trust Chinese immigrants with accented English and limited American credit history regardless of how solid their business proposals are or how much they've saved. Wei had immigrated from Guangzhou 9 years earlier, had worked as a warehouse stocker and then bookkeeper while learning English and saving money, had researched Asian grocery markets meticulously for 2 years, had created spreadsheets showing realistic paths to profitability, had saved $42,000 over nearly a decade. He needed $48,000 more to cover rent deposits, inventory, equipment, licenses. Banks said no 11 times. Different reasons each time, but same result. Immigrant entrepreneurs are too risky regardless of preparation. After the final rejection, Wei's 16-year-old daughter Lin connected him with community organizers who explained that community crowdfunding could provide capital when banks wouldn't. Wei felt uncomfortable asking for money, but organizers explained this was investment, not charity. Community members funding businesses they wanted to see succeed. Over 2 months, Wei raised $53,000 from 247 different investors, mostly small contributions of $200 to $500 from Chinese community associations and Vietnamese networks and Filipino groups and Korean churches and Pan-Asian organizations and Beacon Hill neighbors who wanted diverse local businesses. The store opened with 300 people attending the ribbon cutting. It was immediately busy, exceeded first-year projections by 18%, paid equity investors 8% returns, gave store credit investors 120% of their contributions. Wei hired immigrant employees, opened a second location, helped 7 other immigrant entrepreneurs raise community capital after bank rejections. 3 years later, converted to cooperative ownership structure, genuine community ownership accountable to the neighborhood. Banking discrimination against immigrants isn't subtle, it's systematic. Wei's business plan was excellent. His financial preparation was exceptional. Banks still said no because he didn't fit their profile of who deserves capital. This happens to immigrant entrepreneurs constantly regardless of merit. Community crowdfunding proved Wei's business was viable. His success didn't validate his worthiness. Community members knew that already. It exposed banking institutions' failure to recognize viable businesses when owners don't match their assumptions. The difference between Wei's grocery store existing and not existing was community members investing amounts banks would consider trivial, $200, $500 checks from people who wanted to shop locally and support immigrant entrepreneurship. Those investments returned profits while serving neighborhood needs. Banks rejected the same opportunity as too risky. That's not risk assessment, that's discrimination. Like, subscribe, and share if you believe immigrant entrepreneurs deserve equal access to capital. Join the conversation. Have you or family faced discrimination accessing business loans or capital? What happened? Share below. Remember, Wei wasn't unprepared or unrealistic. He had excellent business plan, 9 years steady employment, $42,000 saved, detailed market research. Banks still rejected him because of who he was, not what he proposed. Entrepreneurship barriers aren't about merit. They're about systemic exclusion. Support community development financial institutions. Support immigrant entrepreneur programs. Support cooperative business models.